Great. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the 2025 legislative prep meeting. This one specifically dealing with education emerging issues in school funding. My name is Michael Griffith. I'm a senior researcher and policy analyst with the Learning Policy Institute. I work on school finance issues here. Today's session is done in partnership with our friends at the Education Commission of the States, the National Association of School Boards of Education, and the National Conference of State Legislatures. This is one in a series of presentations that we've made. You can see the others here, building and retaining teacher workforce, long-term solutions in teacher shortages, and eliminating chronic absences were sessions that we have done before. They're all available on our website. We've recorded all of these. So if you're interested in those topics and you'd like to see those, please feel free to go to our website, lpi.org, and you can take a look at each one of those. Our session today will be focusing specifically on emerging issues in school funding. I'll be presenting along with Dan Thatcher, a senior fellow from the National Conference of State Legislatures, and we'll be talking about different emerging issues that we've seen in 2024, and we're thinking we're going to see in 2025. Then we're going to have a panel session, and joining us on that panel will be Senator Laura Sturgeon from Delaware. She is the co-chair of the Public Education Funding Commission, and she'll be talking about some changes they're looking at in Delaware. And then we're also joined by Dr. Lance Evans, who is the State Superintendent of Education in Mississippi, and he'll be talking about some of the achievements they've made recently in changing their school funding formula in Mississippi. So we're going to start, like I said, with talking about 2024 and what we saw as emerging issues. One of the biggest ones that we heard a lot of conversation about was declining student enrollment. Declining student enrollment has impacted education in many states. This has actually been an issue that has been around, especially in states in the middle part of the country, for decades now, where you see districts shrinking in size. Because of that, they're losing funding, and that makes it difficult for them to maintain their services. What we heard even more of this post-COVID, where we've seen these declines at a steep rate. Some of them have come back since COVID. We've seen greater enrollment, but we have not seen the kind of return that we thought we would in a lot of these places. And so many of your states right now are dealing with this. Another big issue we heard, and I know all of you have probably heard in your states, is the loss of federal dollars. And we're going to talk about that in depth in a few seconds, but the loss of these federal ESSER dollars that were designed to help stem the impact of COVID. And then the thing we've seen, and this has been going on for a few years now, is a greater focus on what we call high-need students. These are students like at-risk students, so students from low-income families generally, English language learners, students struggling with learning English, and then special education students. A lot of states are asking, what can we do about these student groups? How can we help them? And realizing how important it is to make sure that you have a sufficient funding and targeted funding for these student groups. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But let's get started with the ESSER funding, and this has been a huge topic of conversation during 2024. Just as a reminder, the three ESSER programs, so this is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, totaled just under $200 billion. That's a significant amount of money and the largest single investment the federal government has ever made in public education, both in dollar amounts and percentage of what they paid for in public education. And these dollars were spent, the majority of which over a 3-year period, but there were still some dollars available for the beginning of this school year, the 24-25 school year. Unfortunately, they completely ran out in January of this year. Now, you could, if you're in some states, you had the option of asking the federal government for an extension, but very few states did that. And so what we've seen now is these dollars are running out in most states and in most school districts, and it's created some issues in funding. So one of the things we talk about is, what are the places that are most impacted by these loss of ESSER dollars? And what we've seen is it's the districts that have an inability to increase their local funding. Because some districts that are higher wealth or in communities that they're willing or able to increase their local property tax, they can offset the loss of these federal dollars. But lower wealth areas, smaller areas, or school districts and states that do not have the ability to raise local funding will be hit most by this. Also, those districts that have a high reliance on Title I funding will be the most impacted. And of course, if you're in a state with a flat or decreasing K-12 budget, you're going to be impacted by this. So you can get a general idea. I think you all know the types of districts in your state that are impacted by this, but those are the ones that you might want to focus on if you're a state policymaker and an advocate to ensure that they're able to make it through this year with the loss of these federal dollars. So what's something you can do in your state to help offset this? Well, a lot of states have looked at shared services, especially for smaller school districts, sharing anything from purchasing things like textbooks, technology, other supplies, and doing it within larger groups, either in regions in the state or the state as a whole. Some states are looking at now purchasing all of their healthcare, not at the district level, but at the state level. So you have greater bargaining power. With those things will come cost savings, but you also lose choice. And so that's why we haven't seen as much movement there, but maybe we will moving forward. Working with third parties, especially Boys and Girls Club, United Way, and others to help provide services within your school. That these are the kind of services maybe you had to cut, like after school or summer learning. And then maximizing federal dollars, especially with Medicaid. I know a lot of states and a lot of districts are already tapping the Medicaid dollars, but if you haven't, that's a route to go. And then finally, looking at adopting a community school approach. And I know many of you know what a community school is, but just as a reminder, community schools provide services and supports for all the students within the school. And they do this by reaching out to service providers in their community. So you hire a community school coordinator, and then they reach out and maybe they bring in healthcare into school or dental care or food services, all of those things, which don't provide an additional cost to the school district, but make sure those services are there for your students within the district. So we're going to talk quickly about high need student groups and the real need for making sure these students receive the funding that they're entitled to and that this funding is directed towards them. So this is a chart that shows you under NAEP, the National Assessment for Education Progress, how students score and what's the percentage of students scoring basic or above. So any student who is not at risk, is defined as at risk or defined as an English language learner, they're testing 70%, 72% or above on each one of these, math and reading in 8th and 12th grade. So the numbers are pretty high actually for these groups if you're not a high need student. What you start to see though is students who are at risk, so students who are from low income families, perform much lower. The number drops even further when those students are English language learners, and further still when they're both English language learners and at risk. What this kind of tells you, if you want to move the needle on test scores in your state, you really want to focus in on these other groups. You want to direct funding towards them. You want to make sure that they have the resources that they need because they are the ones who aren't able right now to test at or above proficient or basic, I should say. One of the other things that we showed the same kind of table, but for graduation rates, it looks very similar. What you're seeing is your graduation rates for the students who are high needs just are not where they are compared to a general ed student. So this is real proof that you need to put resources in these areas if you want to improve education in your state. And we've seen a lot of states already do this, right? There are 43 states already fund students from low-income families, 48 states provide additional funding for English language learners. The numbers drop though when we look at who funds both those groups. And again, if you think of that table, the students who were both English language learners and came from low income families, scored the worst, but only 35 states currently provide funding for students who are in both areas. We call that dual funding. That's something to think about in your state, that allowing that provision for a student to get both of those, not just one of those two pockets of funding, could really help move the needle. And then there are other groups that the research is now showing that they really need additional support within funding formulas. This includes students experiencing homelessness, foster youth, and migrant students. And some research out there shows that the gap between students experiencing homelessness and a traditional at-risk student is as great as the gap between an at-risk student and a general ed student. So these are students that need additional supports, but most state formulas do not provide those supports. There are only about 5 states that provide any additional funding for students experiencing homelessness. And even then, it's pretty limited funding. So in the next legislative session, as you're thinking about how to help students, this is one group that you could really think about. And we've got some research that you can take a look at, and I think it's linked into the chat, talking about the needs and the supports that these students who are experiencing homelessness require. Now I'm going to kick it over to Dan Thatcher, who's going to talk about what they're seeing at the National Conference of State Legislatures and current trends in legislation in states and some of the bigger topics that they are dealing with. So Dan, I'll kick it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you to the Learning Policy Institute for inviting the National Conference of State Legislatures to participate in this webinar. And thank you, Mike, for your remarks and presentation. I am very grateful for LPI and Mike for the work that I've been able to do at NCSL on education finance. I've been with NCSL for a cumulative 17 plus years, and I appreciate the mentorship that I've received from Mike. At the beginning, this is probably maybe our 40th time presenting with each other, by the way. We figured it out. So I want to dig into the legislation that we've been tracking over the last year. And this also includes the legislation that we tracked in 2023. These are some of the pop outs of the different types of the topics of legislation that we've been tracking, and those that particularly have some kind of impact on finances. Number one, by far and away, is that there's been a focus on legislation and budget earmarks, et cetera, targeted at students who we would refer to as special student populations in this context. And those special student populations would include students from low-income backgrounds, sometimes we refer to as at-risk, students eligible for special education services, English language learners, students experiencing homelessness, students in foster care, gifted and talented students, twice exceptional students even. We're starting to see that come up in some legislation. So I will show in a moment some of the impact of this targeted legislation towards these students. I also want to point out that there's been a lot of activity in legislatures to support educators on a compensation level. So there have been very good times for states over the last few years in terms of their revenues. Very unexpected in terms of what the revenues were, how they've performed given the projections. And a lot of the surplus revenues that they've had have been put back into teacher compensation. A slide that I'll show in a moment will demonstrate how that's impacted teacher compensation. But a lot of the legislation that we've seen is focused on teachers, teacher recruitment policies, teacher retention policies, mentorship policies, and again, increases in compensation and pay. The other things that we are seeing a lot of activity on include facilities. In my own work, I've been getting more questions on facilities in the last few months than I ever have, and also on transportation are the other big topics that we're seeing. And Mike had brought up the point of identifying students who are English language learners, at risk, students living in poverty. I recently conducted another sweep of legislation and statutes that address the proxies that are used to identify students living in poverty. So this is recent as of just a month ago. And in this, I lumped together free and reduced price lunch with community eligibility. The federal community eligibility provision, a federal provision which went into force and effect in 2015, really changed the landscape for the proxies that we use to identify students from low-income backgrounds. So for this purposes, I'm just including these here. Eligibility for federal assistance programs includes eligibility for programs like SNAP, TANF, Head Start, CHIP, Medicaid, etc. And when English language learner students are included as a proxy metric for students in poverty, when that's included in the statute, I've included that here. Now, the thing I want to point out about this particular map and the demonstration of the different number of proxies that states use is that this has changed dramatically since even 2020. States have been very active in this area. So I don't know. I'd have to go back and count. I should do this to find out all the number of new proxies that have been added. But when states lost the ability to use free and reduced price lunch as a proxy, they lost a pretty effective measure at, though it had its problems, pretty effective measure of identifying students from low-income backgrounds for purposes of additional funding. So now that that's gone, the strategy is to use as many different proxies and identifiers as you possibly can, because even with all the different additions through direct certification, et cetera, we're still losing some and missing some of the students that we were able to identify with the free and reduced price lunch metric. So again, more work on this ahead. A little bit more about the funding for students with special backgrounds or from special populations. And here's some just a basic picture of the number of students that we're looking at, the proportion of those students to the general student population in the United States. 53.3% eligible for reduced price lunch, 12%, or excuse me, 15% for special education services, 2% for those experiencing homelessness, and the 10% for English language learners. Now, this graph here, I stole from the Rakes Foundation. Thank you, Rakes Foundation, for this great graph. But it highlights some of the importance of investing directly in certain student demographics. Washington began in, I think, early 2014 to direct more funding and resources for students experiencing homelessness. And not only did they do that, but they also increased the coordination efforts among all the different state agencies and schools that provide services for students experiencing homelessness, and importantly, how to identify them. And they improved their efforts for how they identified this vulnerable population. And as they did, their graduation rates steadily improved. And I think it's a great story that we can tell. And it's also a great story of how directed and targeted funding can really support different student demographics. I had mentioned earlier about the investments that states have made in teacher compensation. And this is a graph that I found very interesting that demonstrates the growth in compensation between the education sector and the private sector. And as we can see, local and state education salaries were below that of the private sector for a long time. And I will say that in fiscal years 2021, 22, 23, and even in 24, when states were receiving revenues well above their expectations, they had an opportunity to reinvest in education. And when they did, they invested a large number of that in teacher compensation. $286 million, for example, in Oklahoma, just for teacher pay raises. 5 states increased spending above 10%, and many states much more. Increases were driven in interest in, again, teacher pay, retention, these kinds of policies. But I will say that inflation has been our enemy in this situation, because a lot of the investments were held neutral when you adjusted for inflation. So again, we will be closely watching inflation over the next few years because it really does impact the take-home pay and also the purchasing power of schools. Finally, moving on, one last demonstration of maybe the role that Title I funds play and federal revenues play. This is a data visualization that I created showing from district to district where the revenues come from for each district versus state, local, and federal dollars. So this is in beta mode. It's not quite perfect yet, but you can see here for each district where the state where the revenues are coming from. One thing I do want to point out here that that states, for the state revenue side, revenues are slowing down a bit. There's smaller surpluses looking into fiscal year 2025. For states that still have solid footing, there's still many states are still looking at tax cuts. But overall, the revenue picture for states is still, we're using the term solid footing. We'll see how it goes. On the expenditure front, we're going to continue to see investments in students who have special needs or from special backgrounds, et cetera, as we've talked about before, and a lot more in facilities in capital investments and maybe some support for debt service as well. The last thing I want to say that given all this too, we're seeing some exogenous pressure on school budgets, particularly from increases in insurance, property insurance, and also inflation. So those are some of the big pressures that we're seeing on budgets moving forward as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Michael Griffith.
Thanks, Dan. You guys have such great information. And I'd also, encourage anyone to go to your website. Now, is this like the Title I information here? Is this available on your website, or is this?
It is through the QR code below.
Oh, perfect.
We'll get it up there though.
Yeah, it's really useful, and Dan puts together a lot of great information. I always feel like too, you have to ask him for the secret menu, like at one of these restaurants. He has a lot of stuff in the back room that might not be on the primary website. So
always reach out. I probably have a data visualization for it.
Great. Thanks again, Dan. All the things Dan talked about, all the things I talked about, and a lot of other stuff are forcing states to start looking at changing their funding formulas. This happens all the time. I mean, about once every 2 years or so, we see a state making a major overhaul in their funding formula. But I just wanted to show you here, since 2000, these are the states that have completely overhauled their funding formula. This doesn't include states like Colorado, who kept the same basic formula, but made some major changes to it. There are some others that we can debate that might need to be included on this too, but it gives you a general idea that there's been a lot of change happening. Some of it litigation led, but an awful lot of it led by governors or legislators realizing that their funding formula, the way it's currently constructed, is not working for their kids. And so they're going through and redesigning formulas primarily now student focused, as opposed to being sort of building focused or focused on position hiring. They're focused more on the students themselves. So we're going to have in our panel discussion talk with Superintendent Evans from Mississippi and Senator Sturgeon from Delaware. In Mississippi, they've adopted a new funding formula just here in 2024, made some major changes to the way they fund their students. And then we're going to talk to Senator Sturgeon, who they are just in the beginning of their process in Delaware, looking at making some changes to their funding formula. They put together a commission. So we thought it would be helpful for you all to hear from both of them about, what has happened in a state that has been successful at making changes, and what's happening in a state that's thinking about moving towards this and changing their system. So I'll start with you, Superintendent Evans. If you could tell us, just what's happened in the past year with school funding. I know it's been a lot. I know 90 seconds isn't much time to talk about it, but if you could do that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Right quick. So our previous funding formula, which was referred to as a Mississippi Adequate Education Program, was in place for 27 years, and it was only fully funded 4 of those 27. So it become a point of contention and almost a little bit of a joke, if you will, that it was never funded. And just like many other funding formulas, it was solely based on funding the personnel rather than the individual needs of the student. So in this, which caused many issues, the primary differences between MAEP and the new funding formula, which is simply called the Mississippi Student Funding Formula, is the way the weights are calculated. So previously we worked on average daily attendance, which the months of October and November, you took the average of attendance there, which many states I'm sure do that. We transitioned over to average net enrollment, which that data pool is on the last day of the month in October and November. That way you're funding the actual number of students that are in the seats. So it takes out that attendance fluctuation piece. The thing that was very important, as I said earlier, that transition from a personnel-based funding formula to a student-based was the way the weights were calculated, as well as what's included in the weights. In Mississippi, we've seen a very large influx of EL students, and there was absolutely no funding for those students prior to this. But you have, in our state, you have weights for low income, English learners, gifted students, career and technical education, special education. We broke it into 3 tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3, and there is additional weighting based on the tier. So think of tier 1 as a student maybe with a speech language issue versus a student has a traumatic brain injury in tier 3. So there's also a piece in there that deals with sparsity. The calculation in Mississippi is if you have less than 8 students per square mile, then that's where the sparsity piece kicks in. One other piece, in addition to the low income weighting, we also have a concentrated poverty weight of 10% that comes into play. So it's what I would tell you is in the beginning, we weren't really sure exactly what the outcome would be, but it's been a very positive outcome. Things are, obviously every 3 years, they'll recalculate base student cost, but that's just a very general overview. And I know you may ask another question or two on the backside that'll give me an opportunity to give a little more explanation as to what that looks like.
Great. So yeah, it's one of these, it's a huge change that you made, and it's very difficult to go from one to the other. Can you talk about like the process you all used? How were you able to get people to kind of buy into this, to be open to?
So I will tell you, that's almost like it's the work that goes in on the front end piece. I'm sure in Mississippi specifically, we're a very relationship driven state, and we have 141 school districts here. So, and each of those obviously has a superintendent that runs those districts, and we're a local control state in Mississippi. So what was very important was that we engaged, we have 2 primary superintendent programming pieces, associations. I'm sorry, I was at a loss for words. So it was to make sure that we got them on board with it and they understood. And in that process, it was legislatively driven as well as governmental driven, but the governmental piece involved bringing the superintendents and the associations and the Mississippi. I was not in the current position that I'm in now at that point in time. I actually came into it on I was in the process of transitioning, but in the process of the development of the work. So it's getting your people involved on the front end, and making sure they have a voice is extremely important, but also communicating it back to the constituents in your different areas, in the different counties. We have 82 counties in Mississippi. But I'll tell you one piece of advice that I would give you on the front end to make sure that that it's more digestible, the transition and funding formula like this, because it is a complete paradigm. It's like literally flipping it over and taking a different approach. Is you need to be prepared to build in funding for a couple of transition years. So what we did is we figured base student cost on the 2024 school year, and no district in Mississippi receives less funding, no matter if the students are there or not. Even if you've had a decrease in student population, you will receive no less funding for 25, 26, or fiscal year 27 as what you did in 24. So what that did is that allowed for a transition because just like you said earlier, Mississippi's experienced fluctuation in our public school student population. We are up and down. But it has those additional funds, once our constituents understood the idea of funding the student and the needs versus the personnel piece, it made more sense. So you got to get people. In our case, it was very important to get our people on board with it and to make sure they understood it on the front end.
Now that you've been through the process and you all have adopted this, is there anything you would tell people? I mean, you kind of talked about this, like, what should they watch for? Where are the landmines? What can they do? What are the lessons learned through all of this? And
Another very important piece of this was for this year, our session starts next month, second week of January. So this was a very, the process between the legislative and the department, we worked together very well on this. They're very open to any legislative amendments that we need in case we found some of these, just uh-ohs that we didn't realize were there. One piece in particular, Mississippi is a very career and technical driven state. And previously we have funded career and technical courses in grades 7 and 8. Well, that transitioned in this new formula in which those courses are not funded anymore for 7th and 8th grade students, which equates to a substantial amount of money for our districts. So that has allowed us to come in and I'll use the word massage as we needed to try to find funding, but also it's allowed us in the department to utilize and shift funding around to help cover some of those costs that are associated with that. But basically the way it looks like now is we have average net enrollment. To sum it up, you take your average net enrollment, then you take your total of the average net enrollment weights per student. Then whether or not you qualify for the sparsity add-on, you add that, you multiply that by the base student cost, and then you subtract out the local contribution. So another significant difference in this is the local contribution is subtracted from the total funding amount now, where previously it was on the front end of the calculation, if that makes sense. So and I think in all, maybe there were 3 districts that would have experienced less funding or that caused their local contributions to have to increase some. So overall, it's working itself out.
great. Yeah. And I think that's so important to talk about that 3-year transition you have to make sure people are going to be taken care of. That takes a lot of the nerves out of the room, right? And people feel more confident. So thanks for that. I'm going to transition over now and ask Senator Sturgeon some questions about what they're doing in Delaware. They're probably a year or 2 behind you all in Mississippi. But just for a quick summary and to let you all know, the type of funding formula in Delaware and the old formula in Mississippi is the type of system that about 6 states have now, which is primarily focused on funding positions. So it's sometimes called a resource allocation formula. Sometimes it's called a position allocation or teacher allocation. What it is you total the number of your students, and for every 20 or 25 students, you get a teaching position. And for every 100 students, you get a counselor and things like that. And then the state pays for those. It's very kind of top-down controlling system. And so a lot of states that have that are looking at moving away. So with that in mind, Senator Sturgeon, could you kind of talk about what led you all to create the new School Funding Commission and what your thoughts were about that? So.
Sure. Thanks for that question and for having me on this webinar. I saw that some other states, when you had up earlier, started changing their funding systems because of litigation and others through legislation. So we're a bit of a combination of both. There was a lawsuit brought forth by the ACLU and local education advocates against the state because of the ongoing disparities in the outcomes for students who are low income versus students who are Black and brown versus white students and so forth. In order to settle that lawsuit, the state agreed to do a couple of things. One had to do with property reassessments for the local funding piece of our education funding system. The other was to commission an independent report that would look into how we fund our schools and how much we fund and compare it to other states and give us some guidelines and show where we fall short and what we would need to do in order to adequately fund our schools. And that report was completed. It was done by the American Institute of Research. And that was all that the lawsuit required. So that's why I say it's a combination between litigation and legislation. The lawsuit only said the report had to be commissioned and completed. It didn't say that we had to actually take the recommendations in the report and do anything with them. So here comes the legislative piece. I'm the chair of education in the Delaware State Senate and a former teacher of 25 years in our public schools. And so I and the teachers union and my friends in some of the education think tanks in Delaware said, okay, we have to take this report and do something with it. We're not just going to let it sit there. And so we formed a commission through legislation called the Public Education Funding Commission. And that commission's task is to figure out, is our current funding system the right one? Is it adequate? And if not, what do we need to change to make sure that our student outcomes are improved and that our funding is equitable across all different student groups, including, most importantly, some of those vulnerable student groups who have been falling behind. So it was litigation that led to legislation, and we've only had about 4 meetings so far of this commission, but we are going to continue through the new year, and we have some recommendations due in October, and then final recommendations due July of 2026.
So one of the things that makes your commission sort of unique is in a lot of these other states, they have said, we're just going to blow up the system and we're going to start with a brand new formula. You all aren't that way. So could you talk a little bit about that? That it is, I mean, you're not starting with blowing it up. You're starting with just talking about you're open to any changes, right?
That is correct. So listen, the commission is pretty diverse. There's 31 members, and there are some members who know very little about education funding and are learning. We're teaching them. That's part of what we do when we meet. But then there's others that know a lot about it. And there's some that are very opinionated as to what they'd like to see, and others who are open. So there probably are some members of the commission who would be more team blow up the system and completely start from scratch and implement a weighted student funding system, a student-based as opposed to a resource-based. We have a resource-based currently, and we call it in Delaware the unit count system, but it's what we were referencing earlier, where we fund positions. We haven't made the final decision. The commission hasn't come together and voted on which direction we're going to go, but based on the conversations I've had as the chair of this commission with members of the commission, there does seem to be a certain, I get the feeling that people are coalescing around taking the system we do have and making the necessary improvements to it to make it work. And I personally, I'm just on vote of 31 members, but I can see that could work, that could lead to immensely greater equity and immensely greater adequacy if we fund our education system the way the AIR report recommended we do, which, by the way, that report said we are underfunding our schools by $500 million to $1 billion. So a combination of more money, but also allocating resources based on need, based on multilingual learner status, based on low income status, and what one thing we already do is special education status. You can pour many more dollars into the students who have those characteristics without blowing up the system. You can keep the system you have and still create greater equity. So realizing that has led people to say, maybe we could move more quickly and get better funding and better allocation of resources without blowing up the system. Blowing up the system is going to be politically difficult, And it's going to take more time to figure out what the new system looks like than just fixing the system we have. So there are definitely some advantages to keeping what we have. And I'm certainly open to that. And my sense is a lot of the commissioners are as well.
And just really quickly, could you kind of talk about, you have 31 members on the commission, which is pretty large.
Yes.
Can you talk about a little bit about the membership and why you kind of made it that size?
Sure. And you were with me recently where we kind of got criticized for conference for not making it even larger in a sense. So yeah, so this is there's a real tension between wanting the commission to be a manageable size where the people can really get together and talk and hear each other out and make decisions through consensus ideally, versus making sure every potential stakeholder group in the entire state is represented. And it's really difficult to do both. So 31 was about as small as we felt we could make it while still making sure all the important stakeholder groups were represented. There are definitely people who have criticized us and said it's too big, but to them I would say, well, who would you eliminate? And then recently we were criticized at this conference for not including, for example, students. There are no students on the commission. Now, I think the other groups that they asked about, like spec ed parents and spec ed specialists, they are actually included. It may not be obvious because some of the people's titles, some people fit more than one role. They may have spent their entire career as a special ed coordinator, but now they happen to be an assistant superintendent of a school district, but that doesn't, take away that they did their career, advocating for special education resources. So we do have a really good mix. And I think perhaps the only missing piece is a student voice, but the difficulty when you include people who don't have background in education funding is there's a lot more you have to do to bring them up to speed, to teach them what our current system is and what it looks like, what alternatives would look like. But we have been doing that for the members who don't have a background in education finance, of whom there are many. And if we do need to include a student voice when we relaunch the commission when legislative session starts in January, we'll do that, and we'll bring them up to speed as well. So it's just trying to balance people who have an interest and a stake in our education system, and represent all the various groups that care about our education system, of which of course there are many, and it not being so large and unwieldy that we'll never be able to come to any kind of agreement on anything.
Great, thanks. Really appreciate that for both of you. I mean, it's good to hear that there's a success story out there, and it's good to hear that there's a state where you're just plugging away and trying to do it. And there are a lot of difficulties there, but it's worth it in the end. So we're going to open it up now for Q&A, and I'm going to start with the first question to Dan. And I know this is one that kind of puts you on the spot, but I'm hearing it a lot. I'm guessing you're hearing it a lot. What do you think the new administration in DC, new incoming president, could make major changes in Department of Ed? What do you think will happen, and what can people sort of do to prepare? And I'll tell you my answer very quickly. I don't know what's going to happen. And I don't know what we can do, but maybe you have an answer for everyone.
Wise answer for your part. To quote a federal economic advisor in a administration from the 70s, I believe that he said, those who live by the crystal ball end up eating glass. And I think that that's exactly what will happen if I try to say, I think there's so many different variables in the air, including what happens with the economy kind of writ large. And then if there aren't any actions at the federal level that impact Medicaid spending, for one, and then any of the education programmatic spending, that can have some, particularly with Medicaid spending, some ripple down effects on state budgets. So if if we're in a recession, counter-cyclical is the nature of Medicaid budgets, that where there's greater pressure on the state match for Medicaid, there's greater pressure on other budget items down the road. So that's kind of what we're looking for, and keeping an eye on that. But I don't know, who knows? Maybe there'll be increases in federal education spending that we weren't anticipating for some unknown reason. I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough because it is unpredictable. It's always unpredictable when you get a new administration, and this administration has said some different things that, could make some major changes if they come through. So it's tough. So the next question is for Senator Sturgeon, and it is from Zahaba from Center for American Progress. And she asked, how are lawmakers thinking about the possibility of greater local flexibility given the rigidity of your existing school funding formula in Delaware? Is it being embraced, or is it being kind of pushed back? And so if you could kind of talk about how open are people to greater flexibility, because your current system isn't that flexible. It's got some rigidity to it.
Yeah, I happened to read that question in the chat, and I recognize the name, and as someone that people in Delaware have worked with in the past. So yes, flexibility and accountability are going to be important pieces of the new system, we hope. But first, we need adequacy and equity. And so, like, to me, those are my 4 pillars that I'm considering most important. I think it was interesting when we had our last meeting, and Mike was there because we have the state, the Department of Education has hired LPI to help us with some of the research that we need for the modeling and such, and just giving background information and what other states have done. So so at our last commission meeting, one of the superintendents who presented, or chief financial officers who presented what our current system looks like and what they like about it and what they know needs to be changed about it, was asked about flexibility by a commissioner. And his answer was, well, you can't have any flexibility when you can barely hold the building up because you don't have enough anything. We're just so underfunded, and everyone is just like juggling to do a million different jobs, and class sizes are too big, and they're not enough admin to support the teaching staff, and therefore aren't able to support the students the way they'd like to. So it's understandable that flexibility isn't top of mind for many people who are actually in the education system, living it every day, because really their top consideration is adequacy. Once you have all the positions filled that you need to have, and you have staffing at the levels it should be, so that you have smaller class sizes, and so you have enough supervisors to support teachers, and so the teachers can, do the job of educating students and meeting all their needs, academic, social, emotional. Then you can start talking about flexibility and how you play around. But it is I would say it's a secondary consideration because we're just so underfunded. However, in my ideal world, if we were fully funded and able to have adequate staffing levels and smaller class sizes and enough supervisory positions to provide the supports teachers need to serve their students, then I think flexibility should be built into the system. Now, we do have a lot of charter schools. About 14% of our students go to charter schools. They have a ton of flexibility. They get the money and they can pretty much do what they want with it. Our traditional public schools, non-charter schools, do not have as much flexibility. That's true. They have to spend the money they get on positions. There is flexibility on what positions they spend it on. There's some amount of position money that can be traded in and spent on other things. But that's going to have to be part of our discussions. Part of our discussions going forward, once we settle on what direction we're going in terms of what it looks like, will be how do we build more flexibility in, if that's what people feel they want and need to be more successful.
Thanks. And just Superintendent Evans, I'd like to ask a follow-up with that. Is you've gone through this now, you put in the new system, and again, to let people understand, under your old system and the Delaware current system, you as a superintendent in the school district were told exactly how many positions you could hire for everything, both teachers and other positions, how much money you could spend on other areas. You're in a unique position because you were a school superintendent under the old system. So were you nervous when you started hearing about moving to a new formula as a school district superintendent? Thinking about that on the ground, because it is a completely different way of thinking. And,
It does cause, it did cause a little anxiety in the beginning until you understood that. So Mississippi's funding formula was also very rigid in the beginning when we were looking at it from a personnel, standpoint of a personnel basis, just exactly as you described. X number of students equaled X number of funding for X number of employees. And anything over and above that had to come from local ad valorem, like your local tax dollars. So we would fill the gaps, if you will, with that, which of course causes you to have to raise that local tax as needed. I will tell you from our standpoint, we appreciate the flexibility, but I will tell you some of the messaging that has come from the department out to the districts is with that flexibility becomes more responsibility, because you have to understand that now that you're just getting a dollar amount, X dollars to take care of all students' needs, you have to be, of course, people are fiscally minded anyways, but you have to be very much more strategic, because there is no real, I guess, best practice established yet. So you have to make sure you're meeting the needs of all those students, and it's just it's one of those deals. Like I said earlier, more flexibility equals more responsibility on the process. But people are good with it. They really appreciate it.
good. Thanks for that. So one of the questions we have is, and I'm going to take a first shot at this, and then Dan, you can tell me what I got wrong. How can states better account for poverty in light of universal free meals in K-12? So just to let you know, the vast majority of states used to use and still do use free and reduced price lunch as their identifier for at-risk students within their funding formulas. What has happened, though, is community eligibility program that allows you to provide free lunch to all of your students, and you don't have to collect that data anymore, means states can't use that for the most part, and they've been drifting away from it. So what they've looked for are other measures. Very often it's things that are number of students belonging to government service programs. So things like, food stamps and others, local healthcare CHIP program and things like that. That has helped, and that has allowed states to find a new way to count students. Unfortunately, what those counts tend to do is miss families who are working poor. What they capture are those families who tend to be in the lowest income bracket. But free and reduced price lunch, the reduced part captured up to 185% of the poverty level. So these were families who were working, who had income, but it was not sufficient. And so we've seen states who move over to this new type of system, where they're looking at families who qualify for different government services. They tend to miss out those working poor families. So that's one of the things you have to think about. Dan, I know you had a big slide that you showed during your presentation that talked about some of these things. Can you talk about that a bit more? Or?
Yeah, the other option that states are looking at is the information provided through the U.S. Census Bureau from the American Community Survey. And what can be difficult about that is that it's not a census. It's just a statistical interpretation of where pockets of poverty exist from one neighborhood area, statistically speaking. The other thing that we have seen is some experimentation around using income tax reporting and looking at people's income, the parents of students, but that can be tricky because the guardians may not be the tax-paying parent, perhaps may not be the guardian, et cetera. Not everyone pays income taxes. The other thing that I like to say that I've heard from Massachusetts, who is really the first state to dig into this problem, is that it's a kitchen sink approach, that they added a couple of different direct certification options. So the direct cert would be eligibility for those services, like Mike said, the SNAP, Medicaid, CHIP, and they still were not getting the funding the students they want to use to. So they just kept adding on every possible conceivable metric that they could find, and So we're starting to see that with some states too, where there's some states that have 13 different criteria that you could be, any eligibility for any one of those would make you eligible for the at-risk identification. It's a tricky nut.
Yeah, right. And it's just one of these things we have to deal with. The free and reduced price lunch was a very easy measure. It's very clear. People understood it. It was collected in a very clear and easy way. But it makes sense why we're moving away from it. But now we've got to find some other things to do. And you can see, like you're saying, there's a lot of states experimenting with this right now to make sure they get that mix correctly. And Massachusetts is one. If you all are thinking, of looking at a state, they've done a good job with it, and they've sort of worked with it over the last few years to make sure they get their measure as good as they can possibly get it. So I think we're coming to the end of our Q&A. I'd just like to ask one last question, I guess, and that is one thing you all think will come up in the next year. So Dan, I'll start with you. Just one thing in school funding that you see happening in the next year.
Oh, it has to be school funding? Okay. Well, there's so many different things, but I'm going to have to say, because it's just front of mind, and I keep getting asked this over and over, is the question around school facilities and how to better fund school facilities. It's not the most exciting topic, but it's an important one.
Agreed. Senator Sturgeon, can you just talk outside of sort of the commission that you work on, but as a chair of ed, what do you see as sort of a big issue coming up in Delaware for school funding this year?
I don't know that this is necessarily outside of the commission, because it is something the commission, I think, is going to take up at some point. But I think for Delaware, now I'm not talking about national trends, because I'm very focused on Delaware and I don't follow that much about what's going on in other states other than what you bring us. But the referendum reform, Delaware is one of the few states that requires, even for operational costs, school districts have to go out to referendum each time, and there's all kinds of problems with that. And it's a tough political thing to tell the voters, for legislators who want to get reelected, to tell voters, we're gonna pass legislation that takes away your power to vote on whether you're taxed more. And so it's a tough one. And I hope that this is the year that we tackle it, or that we start to really put people on notice that this is not the best way to fund our schools. So that's for the local piece. So I'm hoping there'll be some movement in the direction of allowing our local school boards to at least raise to a certain percent the school taxes for operating costs. And then if they want to go beyond that, fine, go to referendum.
Great, thanks. And Superintendent, any thoughts on issues emerging in Mississippi heading into 2025?
I think the only real funding piece that I think will come into the picture will be we're in a very deep conversation now around choice and what that looks like potentially in district to district transfers, which it's not, from the standpoint of the funding formula piece, is not an issue, because obviously would be included in the average net enrollment in your transitioning between districts, as long as you were there to be captured in October and November. The question comes back to a bit of the point the senator was making about what does that look like if you are in a district in which as a constituent you're not taxed very high versus going into one where you are, and making that difference up. Because if you're in District A, and let's just speak generally speaking, District A, you spend $5,000 per year on your home tax, right? Property tax. District B, that's $20,000 per year. Well, if we're going to District B, who's making up the $15,000 difference? And which the thing that the unintended consequence of that people don't think about is in Mississippi, local boards can ask for an increase in their operational millage, which I can't imagine have to go out for a referendum every time oh my goodness. Yeah, that's whew, man, that makes me sweat thinking about it. But we can ask for up to a 6% increase, up to 55 operational mills is how it works here. But what the unintended consequence of that piece with the choice is, well, what does that look like for passing a bond referendum for school improvements? Because if you're in a district in which your children are going to another, you're much less likely to vote in favor of that. And of course, if you're in that district where you're having to eat the difference in funding, you're much less likely to vote for it. So it's like it's a consequence on both sides. So I think that'll be primarily the biggest conversation that we'll hopefully, like, I'm not looking into a crystal ball because I definitely don't want to eat glass. I've never heard that saying. I'm going to use that. I'll give you credit for it though when I use it.
Great. I want to thank all our speakers today and presenters, and thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. And again, as a reminder, all of these different sessions we've had, providing solutions for the upcoming legislative session, are available on our website. And I also want to thank again our partners at the Education Commission of the State, NASB, and NCSL. Thank you very much, and we appreciate it, and have a good day.